Los Angeles. And this is Sports by Brooks on Fancred, I should say. And today we got a full show for you. We're going to be visiting with Pat Forty, talking college football. SB 206, the law that's been passed in California that will benefit collegiate athletes financially by allowing them to sell their name, image, and likeness. We'll get into that. Pat has kind of a different angle on it. Additionally, we'll talk to Sam Monson of Pro Football Focus. He is their lead analyst, and Pro Football Focus is a big deal these days. All of the National Football League teams have adopted their grading system. They are a go-to if you're a football fan. You already know that if you're watching this. And we'll talk to Darren Heitner. He is an attorney and a prominent one in the sports field, and he is helping to author the Florida bill that will go in front of the legislature in short order and could be passed as soon as this year. Now, California's law is set to take effect in 2023, but they're looking to pass a law giving college athletes a chance to profit off their name, image, and likeness as soon as 2020. And Darren Heitner is one of the guys who's drafting that law, authoring it. And it's going to drop. That bill is going to come out today. So we're actually going to be breaking news. And it's a big deal because it certainly heightens the urgency when it comes to the NCAA and the stance of Mark Emmert, with California set to, again, enact the law in 2023. Well, you have that space of time. But Florida has no such intentions. So I think you saw some comments last night from Mark Emmert as he gave an interview to the Indianapolis Star that indicates for the very first time, and this is not being reported, and there's a lot of people who've read this piece with his comments in it, but don't really grasp what he's saying. Everyone is so consumed with criticizing Emmert, and you can't blame them. Why would they think that he would be open to doing anything? But if you look at Twitter, the Indianapolis Star posted an article last night in which it was a breakdown and transcription of an exclusive interview that the Indy Star had done with Mark Emmert, in which Emmert specifically addresses SB 206 and the whole principle of the law going into effect in California and around the country, possibly federally. And he made some really interesting remarks, and it just gives me the sense, because it's the first time you really see cracks in his stance, because it's always been so pathological, so unbending and staunch. For him to use these words, all of a sudden, the word evolve, the rules evolve. Now, hear me out. I want to read back some of the quotes from Mark Emmert. This is to the Indianapolis Star, and it's addressing the new law in California. This is Emmert. I've been talking to lots of people. As you can imagine, we have 1,100 member schools, and after talking to a full cross-section of presidents, athletic directors, the vast majority of them all, they all see and recognize this is an area where we need to continue to evolve our rules. He goes on, we spent the past decade improving as students' needs changed and made great strides. And made great strides in that direction. Sure you did. Here is another opportunity to address another change going on in the lives of students. How beautiful is that? How latent is that acknowledgement from President Emmert? People aren't putting their head in the sand. In fact, the contrary. Well, from your initial reaction and prior, when the law was still a bill, you certainly weren't taking this tact. This looks like okay, we don't want to sign. You remember if you've ever studied history in World War II, like Japan, the reason that we drop the bombs. Well, this is the pretense of dropping the bombs that we've been told, at least it's presented to us this way, is because the Japanese would not sign an unconditional surrender, just like Hitler would not sign an unconditional surrender. And the minute Hitler died, the people running Germany who took over signed an unconditional surrender. This looks like Emmert is saying, look, we don't want an unconditional surrender. We're willing to work with you, but we will surrender on some things. Now, let me finish up his quotes here. He's talking about the working group. The NCAA has a working group, right? Remember, this is a system, college football and basketball with the NCAA, where the rules are enforced by the schools themselves through in-house compliance departments. Okay? So keep that in mind. That's why you can't remember the last time a star football or basketball player missed a game because of an NCAA violation. The NCAA doesn't and never has enforce its own rules. It comes in and cleans the mess up when the media uncovers it, or a third party comes in. A whistleblower comes in from outside of school and uncovers it. It will never come. The violations that are serious, they'll never come. So that's why, I've said we're in a post-NCAA phase. So let's look at the rest of his comments here. And he's addressing this working group. The same working group, I might add, that includes Gene Smith, Ohio State athletic director, who has said repeatedly that we need to kick California out of the NCAA and that I'm not going to schedule California schools from here on out. He's part of that working group. Somehow, I think that Gene might back down and pump the brakes a little bit on that based on these comments right here. And again, these are last night from Emmert. So let me read this to you. This is the second part of his remarks to the Indianapolis Star. So that's what this working group is working on. A working group is a working on group, or it works. It would take some months before they would finalize any of their rule changes. Okay, let's back up. That's what this group, NCAA working group, is working on. This law that benefits college athletes in respect to their name, image, and likeness, financial benefits. That's what they're working on right now. It would take some months before they would finalize any of their rule changes. But there is a broad-based support for the things the NCAA is already doing around name, image, and likeness. Well, what? It's not doing anything. And it never has. So in other words, there's an inner conflict there. But he's contradicting himself in these statements. But is he saying that people are fighting it there? It sure seems like it, because what they've done in the past is nothing. He goes on, if a student athlete writes a book or produces a song, the rules today say that's not allowed. We have been routinely allowing them to receive compensation that are unrelated to sports. Of course, somehow that's gone unreported. I've never heard of that. Now, here's the key to that statement. And I'll give you an example from way back. I believe it's Rayford Johnson, if I'm not mistaken. Rayford Johnson, who won the well, that's an old guy reference, isn't it? Rayford Johnson. Rayford Johnson, who won the decathlon in the, I think, 1960 Olympic Games, was training at UCLA for the Olympic Games beforehand. All right. He was spotted by Kirk Douglas, who was casting for the film Spartacus. And so Kirk Douglas gets to know Rayford Johnson. He sees him on the Drake Stadium track at UCLA, befriends him, and eventually offers him a role in Spartacus. Now, he's still at UCLA, Rayford Johnson, right? And he's going to go to the Olympic Games eventually. And so he asks the NCAA if he can be in this movie. Right now, remember, let me repeat what Dummy just said, Mark Emmert. If a student athlete writes a book or produces a song, the rules say that's not allowed. He's talking about money from it. But we have routinely allowed them to receive compensation that's unrelated to sports. Right. So how that works, what he's referring to there is, if you get a book sale, if somebody buys your book and you're writing it as a college athlete, and the reason they're buying it is because they know you because you're an athlete, you can't do that. Now, I don't know what obscure example he's citing here, but if you're writing a book and you're a student athlete, the odds are it has something to do with the fact that you're a student athlete and you have a profile as an athlete, and that may play into how many people buy it or if they buy it at all. But if they buy it based on that, your identity, well, then you can't collect that compensation. So it's ridiculous. And so that's what I was leading up to with the Rayford Johnson example. With Rayford Johnson, he was not allowed to appear in the film Spartacus, right? Because the NCAA told him at the time, and I've read this in his autobiography, that the only reason that this is what the NCAA claimed, the only reason that Kirk Douglas wanted to put him in the film was he was a UCLA athlete. Had nothing to do with the fact that he was perfect for the role, from, the way he looked, his body type, his presence, his personality, whatever it may be, right? Which is a big reason why Kirk Douglas, in fact, think about it. You think Kirk Douglas said, oh, he's a UCLA guy, so I'm going to put him in Spartan? No, he saw him working out on the track. And that's why he went up to him, got to know him a little bit. And it wasn't like he was asking him to play, a role in Shakespeare. This is Spartacus. And so that role eventually went to another former UCLA athlete who was long gone out of school, Woody Strode, who went on to be a famous actor. And he's the guy, if you know Spartacus, that's an old movie, but you can look it up. Probably the most famous fight scene of all time in film between Woody Strode and Kirk Douglas with the spears in Spartacus. Look that up on YouTube. It's pretty awesome. So we're taking you through right now the situation with the collegiate athlete financial compensation law situation. And I'm pointing out the blatant intellectual dishonesty of Mark Emmert and hypocrisy that is embedded in his acknowledgement that they are going to move the goalposts. They are going to change the rules, and they are going to allow athletes to be financially compensated. It certainly looks that way from these quotes. How could you, again, what's funny about it is, again, and I started this at the beginning of this discussion. I was on Twitter and everybody's screaming, there he is, there he goes again. And I'm thinking, wait a minute. He just said he's going to change the rules. They're going to change the rules. So people are so blind, and I don't blame them. But that's so common. We talked about it with the TMZ guys, if you remember, I think a couple of days ago. They're the guys that actually, when they release the dash cam footage, guys like Mike Babcock and Evan Rosenblum, they're the guys who actually watch it all, an hour and 26 minutes. And nobody else does that. That's why if you're someone who's starting out in sports media, you're just on your own, independent, whatever it is, you could really make your name easily because the media just skims over stuff because they've all been told not to go in depth on anything, that we don't have attention spans anymore. So that's the situation here. So that's what's happening with Emmert. And I think in the NCAA, it certainly appears. Now, I want you to remember, if you're watching this, whether it's live or on demand, I want you to remember where you first heard this, because I think I'm probably the only person somehow, when you think about what he says here, he says, see, the problem in comprehending this statement is there's contradictory messages, paradoxal messages. It's totally hedged, totally. So, and it's so unlikely that he would acknowledge that they are going to surrender, that your mind is already closed to that possibility when you read what you read here. But clearly, he states, and we'll say it again. So that's what this working group is working on. It would take some months before they would finalize any of their rule changes. But there is broad-based support for the things the NCAA is already doing around name, image, and likeness. That's what I mean. So the NCAA is not doing anything around name, image, and likeness. That's why there's a law. That's why we're granting athletes basic rights as a United States citizen, right? Free market capitalism. So that's why that's so confusing. Because when you read the second part, okay, is he saying that? Why is he saying they're going to change the rules? So what he's really saying is, well, everybody has loved it forever. Everybody supports us, but we're going to evolve the rules. Basically because they're outnumbered. And most importantly, they're not going to be in a position to buy off politicians to hold things up. The horse is out of the barn in California. Now, the only thing I can think of, and I was playing this out through my mind, when you think about a state like Alabama, which has been not so coincidentally very quiet, the state of Alabama, because that's the state where everybody wants that status quo. I mean, they're in as good a position in college athletics because of football as that state has ever been in. I mean, this is truly the golden age. Forget Bear Bryant, not even close to this. So nobody wants to change anything, right? This is a state where, and let me give you an example of why Alabama would be silent in this situation. Okay, why a legislator would not be coming out of the state of Alabama. I mean, it's pretty obvious, right? Everybody's going to be like, shh, shh, we want the status quo. What are you doing? Why would you want to change things? You know, of course, the California law it's not enacted until 2023. But wait a minute. We're going to talk to Darren Heitner, who's authoring a law in Florida that's going to go into effect in 2020. There's a good chance it'll pass. So we'll see what happens in Alabama. But I want to give you an example why they're so silent. The law in California has a provision allowing for a college athlete to hire a lawyer or an agent. Can you imagine? Can you imagine? By the way, it's a little late once you're a college athlete. When you need that agent or lawyer or representative is when you're getting recruited and you're being lied to by everybody about the situation at that school and the situation with their scholarship in general. That's when you need counsel. When you're a 16-year-old kid or much younger than that, I might add. I mean, God knows we've read every single year, about programs. Tennessee signs a 9-year-old. A 9-year-old verbally commits to Auburn. I mean, that stuff happens every year. LSU. I mean, that's when someone needs to be there. And I'm sure, the parents theoretically are involved. But, I mean, think about Nick Saban. What is Nick Saban? He makes $12 million a year. He has a statue, not from Alabama, got that statue in his 50s. No connection to Alabama. No family there, didn't grow up there, doesn't have relatives there. But I think he'd been at the school 4 or 5 years. In his late 50s, gets a statue in the state of Alabama. So now you're a 16-year-old kid in one of the poverty-stricken areas of Memphis. And you're at high school that day, and Nick Saban shows up by himself, which he does a lot. He does a lot of the, he does a lot of the heavy lifting himself individually when it comes to recruiting. So, but think about it. If you're a 16-year-old kid in a poor part of town, probably African-American, right? And think about how marginal that education is, everything that's going on. And Nick Saban shows up and he gets you into a room and he corners you and you don't have a representative. You don't have anybody, not while you're at school. Now, if you were, why would he visit you at school? Because he wants to get you into the office by himself, coach's office. Would you step outside, coach? Saban just gets the kid in there by himself. Right. You're going to say no to a statue. You're going to say no to a guy on the freaking Aflac commercial. By the way, have you seen that Aflac commercial? Have you seen the rings he's got on? Those aren't Alabama rings. They're like Aflac championship. It looks ridiculous. But if you're, put yourself in the position of that kid. Lord knows what Nick Saban's saying to him. Now think about California law has a provision for an agent, and the fact that the state of Alabama has criminalized a college athlete having an agent. It's against the law, and that agent will go to prison if convicted. And it's happened, right? That's an outlier situation. I think Alabama is the only state that's done it. There may be others in the South that have criminalized an agent having an agreement with a college athlete. So that's one of the reasons why you haven't heard any legislator talking about adopting the California law. Of course, the state of California itself, the reputation in the minds of Southerners and people in other parts of the country, right, is cited as well when you read some of the news reports out of different states as they're contemplating this legislation. But what's fascinating to me about this story is how it's being treated in individual states, because it is a signpost of our society in how it's being received and handled and or not handled from state to state. If you go onto my website, SportsbyBrooks.com, you'll see that we have a list of all the states that are now in play and who those legislators are, those politicians who are either expressing interest in the press about moving forward on a bill that would replicate what California is doing, or has already submitted a bill. And there's, I think, 4 examples, and we're about to have the 5th example today. And we're going to talk to the guy who helped to author and draft that bill in Florida, Darren Heitner, coming up later on in the show. Pat Forty will also join us in a few minutes. We'll talk college football with him. We'll talk about this subject. And Sam Monson, one of the top NFL and college analysts in the country, one of the founders of Pro Football Focus. If you're a football fan, you know about that. You go to that website, you may have bought one of their subscriptions to their amazing statistics and grading, I guess you could say, packages. So we have that coming up. It doesn't get any better than that. College football going into the weekend. And Pat Forty, who's the best, and then Sam Monson, who's in that category. And then, we're going to be breaking news. We're going to get some details on here that are nowhere in terms of the details about that Florida law, the specifics, because this guy helped write it. And how soon could it go into effect? And how could it affect recruiting for the Florida Gators, Florida State Seminoles, Miami Hurricanes, and other schools in the state of Florida? And if this is instituted, and you've probably heard this said, if you're following it at all, if this is instituted almost immediately, well, that's going to be a huge advantage for Dan Mullen, Willie Taggart, and Manny Diaz at those schools. And do you think Alabama is going to put up with that? No. The legislature is not. It will enact its own law overnight. It will mobilize. It will mobilize faster than when George Wallace called them in the 1950s, or what was it, early 1960s. Overnight, we'll have it voted into law. And I mean that literally. I'm not kidding. 15 seconds it'll take. In fact, I bet you they already have it done. It's probably already been written up and ready to go in the event that we reach DEFCON 1. But it sounds like, and what I talked about earlier, now you're probably asking the question, well, wait a minute, you just said that Emmert's going to change the rules. Well, who the hell knows? Because of that ridiculous hedge in the statement. Yeah, we're going to change the rules, but the membership doesn't want us to change the rules. That's what he's saying in that statement that I keep hammering on. But don't be surprised. Don't be surprised. And, if it was really going to happen, definitely, you would think that Emmert would make that a little more plain, perhaps. But I think he's got to do a little more politicking. I mean, but this is a situation where you're talking about 150 years of history, of a tradition, of one of the most prominent, unique American customs, stealing money from college football players. It's been going on a long time. And now the scale is vast, billions of dollars every year. One of the problems with this issue is the difference between basketball and football. And it is unbelievable to me that it's not out there, that people don't know. Nobody knows. Nobody knows the big difference between how the NCAA treats basketball. You see what it's doing with Kansas now. And it's also going to release notice of allegations to other schools coming up. I recognize the FBI is involved, right? But it's very aggressive in that situation, even with the biggest programs. I know it's CYA to a certain extent, but with football, nothing. As I said before, you can't name an athlete who's been ruled academically ineligible by the NCAA. I mean, if you think really, really hard, maybe AJ Green of Georgia, that was a long time ago. But when I asked that question on Twitter, there were some people that eventually, in the replies, probably got 150 replies, who eventually got it. But that's the whole point. I mean, all of these college football players, tens of thousands, and you can't name one, or it takes you 20 minutes to Google it. Right? The NCAA only exists, and the NCAA is the schools, even with football. But with football, it's only exists to prevent the compensation to go into the players that's being generated by the schools. That's it. That's the only reason college football keeps it around. This notion that college football, I keep hearing this from people. Ignoramuses. It's going to break away and create its own organism. The NCAA is the model. This empty storefront, that's the business model. Without it, I mean, everything he's talking about, when you hear Emmert, and Emmert is a former long-time college president at football factories like LSU, Washington, and to an extent, Colorado, Mark Emmert, best friends with Gordon Gee, Ohio State, West Virginia right now. You know, these mercenary college presidents that we now have, these free agent, he is the epitome of the guy who gets into it for the money and the private jet and the mansion. And he is downright pathological. It's not a coincidence he's the president, because he's pathological. And I'm sure he's convinced himself that he's right. I mean, just look at those halting statements there as he's trying to acknowledge, yeah, we may have to do something. Everybody's really happy with it right now. Of course they are. We're all doing a great job here at the NCAA, but they may evolve. It's possible. If other states pass it and it's going to be 2020, and then we hear from Alabama and Mississippi, and then I might not get reelected and lose the private jet. I think that's what he's thinking at this point, right? But I want to get to something, though, as part of this story. That this could be, I mean, this is a book. This is, I think of like somebody writing a book or a big article, whatever it is, a magazine story, long form, or a dissertation for your PhD. That's what I'm going to tell you about, is happening within this controversy about SB 206. Here's the problem with this thing, the whole thing. How do you refer to the damn law? It's not really the Fair Pay to Play Act. In fact, it's not pay to play. It's pay for your image, right? But that's the way the dummies in California phrased it. Fair Pay to Play Act. And we all know whatever the name of the law is, whatever that law, is involved with, it's the opposite. And that goes back to what in the French Revolution, the Committee of Public Safety, right, during the Revolution, that murdered more people like in the history of than any organization in the history of the world or government agency. And of course, I don't want to get into all the history because it's too ugly. People don't want to think about it, but that's government. That's what they do. It's just like when you vote on these measures, right? Trying to decipher what they really do and what they really mean. And you automatically know when you're watching a commercial for it, whatever they're saying, like if I'm watching, I'm thinking, okay, what's this about? All right. It's the opposite of whatever you're saying. Okay. That's what it's about. The opposite of what you're saying. So yes or no. So when you look from state to state, and that's what I've been spending a lot of time on over the last few days. This is such a fertile thing. I'm going to put it on the website. I want to put something up on SportsbyBrooks.com kind of following this. And I want to give you an example of something that's happening in relation to this law. That's an illustration of what I just said, because you're thinking to yourself, dude, how interesting could this be? Move on. Jesus. Let's get to the freaking Seahawks. For crying out loud, Russell Wilson. By the way, Russell Wilson, I've never seen anybody do more on the football field. He's an improvisational genius in order to overcome the opponent and go on to win the game. Who was the opponent last night? Why, it was Seahawks offensive coordinator Brian Schottenheimer. Not so much the Rams. It's the play calling. If you remember the Dallas game, the playoff game last year, same thing. That's the only thing holding Russell Wilson back. But I want to give you one example of what I mean. And it's happening in the state of Minnesota. So there is a state representative in Minnesota who wants to submit a bill in support of what California is doing. And his name is Nolan West. Nolan West. He's a white guy. And if you do a Google search on Nolan West, state representative in Minnesota, in the legislature, you're going to find that he has been accused of racism publicly in the past on multiple occasions. And so Nolan West is the guy who wants to, you got to read his statement. You got to read this. So Nolan West is the guy who is going to be sponsoring a bill, the guy who has been accused of racism. And it's been addressed in the Star Tribune and whatnot in Minnesota. So here is Nolan West's statement about the bill that he wants to sponsor that would benefit college athletes financially for their name, image, and likeness. Quote, "It is pretty strange to be citing California for anything, but it is a kind of beautiful bipartisan issue because you have injustices, especially racial injustice," right? He's going to introduce the bill in 2020 in January. Remember what I told you, though. He's been accused of racism publicly. And so let me read the statement one more time. It's kind of a beautifully bipartisan issue because you have injustices, especially racial injustice. You see what he's doing there? And of course, he's a Republican. And he's not alone by any means. There are a lot of, you could call them far-right conservatives who are on board with this issue, but you don't hear them in a place like Alabama for the reasons I've laid out to you. It just depends on the situation, wherever that state senator or representative or whatever it is, or U.S. senator or congressman is from, his district, his situation, what he's dealing with. So you have to take that into account. Certainly this is not, it is a bipartisan issue in some places, in some states. In South Carolina, you have 2 state senators who are sponsoring the bill. They're both Democrats. And I was reading in the state newspaper in Columbia earlier this morning that the majority leader of the Senate in South Carolina said, this thing ain't going to pass. He's a Republican. So, and, you look at other states, other situations, and it's very likely to pass. And like a great example would be Pennsylvania. Ed Gainey is one of the sponsors of the Pennsylvania proposal to do what California is doing. And he's a right-wing conservative guy. So this is the other kind of rhetoric you hear inside the states as they're contemplating this law. He says, quote, "This law promotes fairness. California gives us hope that there's a level of justice we can get to. At the same time, college athletes are helping the schools make millions. Let's help them help themselves. Let's make them some money," right? He also says here, Ed Gainey, he also says he's seen, now this is a paraphrase from the article. This was in the Philadelphia Inquirer. Ed Gainey says he's seen too many constituents and friends return to Pittsburgh after playing sports with too little to show for it. He's met too many African-American athletes from disadvantaged areas, not quite good enough to make it in the pros, who couldn't financially benefit from sports in college when their athletic value was at its peak. African Americans. Now, he's a Republican. Okay. What did I tell you about South Carolina? The leader of the Senate, majority leader in South Carolina, is a Republican, saying ain't going to pass. So it just depends on those individual states. And it also depends to a certain extent on the football team. Clemson is in, of course, South Carolina, like Alabama, wants the status quo. If any school out there wants to maintain the status quo, it's freaking Clemson, right? So now it makes sense why it's not going to pass in South Carolina. And the two state senators who are sponsoring the bill are African American. Forgive me, but I really can't help but think about post-Civil War. I just can't help it. Reconstruction, just can't help it. And the period afterwards. I mean, so I gave you two examples, and we're going to go to Pat Forty here in a second of Yahoo Sports and talk to him about the issue, and also talk some college football, and then talk some pro football coming up. But hopefully that elucidated you on the subject as we get down and dirty on this issue. We've got also Darren Heitner hopefully will join us from Florida to clue us in on what they're doing there, because I think that more than the California law. In fact, I know that the Florida bill, there, by the way, I haven't mentioned, there's already a bill in Florida, and I'm going to ask Darren about this. I mean, there's already a bill that's been submitted by a state representative named Keon McGee, and he has been making the rounds in the media in South Florida. So now we've got another bill coming, and Chip LaMarca is the state representative from South Florida behind the bill that Heitner is associated with. So I don't know what the story is there. I guess the more the merrier, the more likely perhaps that it's going to pass. Maybe it's in separate houses in the legislature. We don't know about this new bill yet unless it's come out in the press and the media while I've been on the air. But that really matters, because if it passes, I think that that's now the gun to the head. I don't think the NCAA has a gun to its head right now. I don't, because you're talking about 2023 and morality and pressure in that's the pressure wrought from, immorality. Don't go there with the NCAA. Don't go there. 150 years of doing nothing. And what did Emmert say in his hedged remarks to the Indianapolis Star? The schools like what we're doing with name, image, and likeness. They like what we're doing. Yeah, deliberately perpetrating this injustice, deliberately withholding the monetary compensation that's due college athletes, many of whom are playing a life-threatening sport, and of course, all of whom are receiving no health care in writing. So, and I'm going to read these, what Emmert says to Pat Forty when we get him on here in a second. I want to hear his thoughts. Based on what Emmert said, and we read it to you earlier. Pat had an interesting article as well about the non-revenue athletes, wrote a column about it for Yahoo Sports. We're going to touch on that because there's been some rhetoric coming out of the schools, school administrators, saying that if this California law goes into effect or other laws, it will limit the opportunities of non-revenue athletes, of course, which is absurd. It's completely untrue. And so we'll touch on that. The fact that, think about swimmers, and that's what his article is about. Think about swimmers who are out there when they're in college or contemplating college, breaking world records, and you become this national celebrity at a very young age, as swimmers often do. and you want to go to college, you want to go to Stanford, you're a great student, whatever it is. So let's bring up Pat Forty of Yahoo Sports and talk to him about this issue and read him over. He's probably read this article, so I'm interested to see if he has read this. Hey, Pat, how you doing?
Hey, I'm good, Brooks. How are you?
I'm great, and thanks for your patience, man. I really appreciate it.
Happy to do it.
So Mark Emmert did this interview with the Indianapolis Star yesterday. I don't know if you've seen that. Have you seen his remarks from that interview?
I saw the remarks, yes.
So I want to run this one back past you, something that he said. He said, that's what this working group is working on. It would take some months before they would finalize any of their rule changes. That's what he said in the article, or to the reporter. Doesn't that sound like a surrender to you? Or does it?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. And now we'll see if I'm sure it's a conditional surrender. Not a,
you know, it's funny, Pat,
surrender.
you know, it's hilarious. I just went on and on about, I gave an example when I read that quote about unconditional surrender in World War II.
Yeah.
So great minds, right? Hilarious.
Absolutely. So, yeah, no, I think it'll be conditional, and we'll see what their conditions are and see if they're acceptable. You know, the horse is out of the barn now, Brooks, I think, on this issue. And so the NCAA has to come to grips with something different than the status quo. But is it going to be far enough towards what California has and what other states are looking at to satisfy athletes and their constituents? I don't know. The NCAA and every conference has been so slow to act on all of this. They've been pushed to this point. So we'll see what their follow through is going to be from this point on.
Well, look at it this way. Alabama has criminalized agents, right? And the California law has a provision to allow for an agent. So I'm thinking that might be one of the things. I mean, the NCAA is definitely going to try to dilute this, water it down, and that might be one of the primary things they remove.
Sure. Yeah. You know, that's the thing. I mean, I'm sure the NCAA, they don't want to bring agents into their midst. I'm not sure they're going to have a choice. They certainly, I think, would probably try to have some sort of limitations or caps on the amount of money that could be there for athletes. Their thing has always been try to tie it to education. I'm not sure how easy that's going to be. There's a lot of complications to this, and they're not right now dealing from an area of strength.
Right. Do you think the Florida law, but the bill that's coming out today, the fact that it's 2020 as the possibility rather than the California 2023 is motivating the NCAA here?
Well, I think it probably has to, that 2023 is now the outside date,
right,
and people could be pushing that down closer to now. And so I think that they have to have some urgency. Now, I know they set up this working group back in the summer, and they did say they wanted findings in October. So they're on their timeline now, but then, how quickly do they turn recommendations into actual legislation? I think that's going to be, are they in a little bit of a hurry up offense from that standpoint? And I think they should be. Now, it may not be anywhere near as easy to pass a bill in Florida as it was in California, but there's obviously other states working to do this much more rapidly.
Visiting with Pat Forty of Yahoo Sports. And Pat, you exposed one of the big lies in the fake defense of people on the side of the NCAA after the California law came out, and that was that this law might limit opportunities of non-revenue athletes. Tell us about the article you wrote.
Yeah, I wrote primarily about a girl named Reagan Smith, who's a world record holder now in the 100 and 200 backstroke. She's, an absolute phenom. You will be hearing about her in Tokyo in 2020 in the Olympics. And last summer in Korea in the World Championships, she broke these world records. And if a swimmer does that, there's FINA, the governing body of swimming, and USA Swimming there to give you a lot of money for these performances. And a total of $140,000 was at her disposal. But because of NCAA rules, she only got to keep about $41,000. So there's $100,000 behind this NCAA blockade that she can't get. And it's not coming from an unscrupulous agent. It's not coming from a rogue booster. It's coming from USA Swimming and FINA. And it makes no sense whatsoever. My daughter's been caught up in similar things, not anywhere near that level of money, but she's on the national swim team, the U.S. national team. She swims at Stanford. She swam in the World Championships. She's entitled to $12,500 in the next 3 months. Don't know whether she's going to be able to get it. It's all tied up in NCAA red tape.
Unbelievable. And by the way, completely arbitrary, whatever those rules are, just made up. Whatever side of the bed an NCAA, faceless bureaucrat in the NCAA got up on that morning, that's why they're not getting that money. It makes absolutely no sense. I wanted to talk football with you briefly. We've got Clemson, and you've been talking about Clemson this week. And I want to ask you a specific question because the great debate surrounds Clemson's offense. Do you think it is the offensive line? Is it Trevor Lawrence? Is it a combination of both why they struggled?
I think it's a combination of those things. Any quarterback's going to struggle a little bit when the line is not very good, and Clemson's line has not been great. They're not as good as last. Been under pressure more this year than he was certainly at the end of last year when we saw him just lighting up defenses. But also, even when Trevor has had time, he hasn't been as accurate maybe as we've seen in the past. He's thrown more interceptions. Maybe he's feeling the confidence of having that gun of an arm, and he's trying to make maybe a few too many plays. But it is surprising. If you saw the North Carolina game wherein they were lucky to win and only scored 21 points, he missed a lot of open guys, missed them high. Was throwing the ball too high on several occasions. He's got 6'4", 6'5" studs that can go up and get it. And if it's too high for them, it's really too high. So I'm surprised and a bit perplexed that he hasn't performed better this year.
It looks like Auburn's going to play the game of the week for the second straight week. At least we thought perhaps it was last week against Texas A&M. Now they're at Florida. And Auburn, of course, is a team that everybody's jumping on right now. They're excited about Auburn. But so far, their big wins have been against Oregon. And Oregon's a pretty good team, so we'll give them a lot of credit for that. But Texas A&M and Mississippi State, teams that perhaps aren't as hot as we thought, especially Mississippi State. So where are you on Auburn right now?
I'm a believer so far, just on resume. I agree. Look, the Oregon win goes a long way. If you go by like the Sagarin ratings, just because there's not a lot of other data yet at this point, a month in, Oregon is the best win that any of the undefeated teams have. And their top three wins of Oregon, Texas A&M, Mississippi State, and maybe those two teams wash out a little bit. But for now, those three are all better than any win Ohio State has. So just based on resume, I put Auburn number one. Now, look test, hard to beat what Ohio State's done. And Alabama isn't far behind. And, there's been a lot of impressive performances. But just based on who have you played and who have you beaten, I like what Auburn's done.
Do you include LSU in there?
Yeah, I'm super impressed with LSU. It's just been so amazing to watch them. They look so different than they did. It's a pretty radical transformation.
I think we're all trying to come to grips with this LSU team. We don't know what to think yet. But what about Florida? Florida, of course, hosting Auburn. Where are you on them?
Yeah, big game, good game. I think it's going to be a defensive slobber knocker. Pretty low scoring. You got Florida playing a backup quarterback who's been good, but he's playing the best defense he's seen. You have Auburn with the freshman quarterback. He's been good, but now he's playing the best defense he's seen. So really, who's going to limit mistakes? Who's going to find a few big plays? Who's going to win the field position and turnover battles? I expect Auburn to win and probably cover the 3 points, but it's going to be close and low scoring.
Visiting with Pat Forty of Yahoo Sports. Nice enough to stop by here on Sports by Brooks on Fancred. Now a tough question. Maybe not so tough, but I think it's tough. Is we had Philip Fulmer come out this week and say, I completely support Jeremy Pruitt, and I'm not interested in getting back in coaching because, of course, the rumors were out that Pruitt might be departing the University of Tennessee football program this season, in season, and that Fulmer might take over on an interim basis. Assess that Tennessee situation for us.
Yeah, it's a total dumpster fire,
yep.
For one thing. I mean, the whole thing is just a complete mess, and Jeremy Pruitt does not look like he is up for the job. I think Phil Fulmer needed to say, though, what he said, because I was certainly speculating and thinking that this is a guy who's always thought that he was prematurely pushed out, always thought he should have still had that job. Would he promote himself for that position? So I think he needed to say, no, I'm not interested in coaching. So I'll take him at his word at this point. But are they still going to have to make a change after this year? It's a lot of money, and it's 2 years, and it would probably not help in terms of lack of continuity and the constant churn they've had there. But if Jeremy Pruitt's not the guy, he's not the guy, and you probably have to make a move.
So this game for me, Ohio State and Michigan State, is a game that it's one of those games that I've got to have on one of my screens because I even though Ohio State has played well and they've blown everybody out, I still don't think we know. You really can't judge them yet. So I think this is really a critical game. What's your thought on that game?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, certainly by far the best defense they will have played. I mean, Ohio State has been Mike Tyson. They've knocked everybody out before the first half is over. So what's it like if they get into a longer battle? You know, are they still as invincible? Do they start getting uptight? Do they play differently? Because they have been fast, loose, furious, and really good. But Michigan State has that kind of team that I think can turn this into more of a grinder game, more of a field position game, make them punt a few times, make them maybe see Justin Fields get frustrated a little bit, force him into a turnover. He hasn't thrown an interception yet this year. The question is, I don't know whether Michigan State has the offense then to do much. The big matchup to me there, Brooks, is Ohio State, number one team in the nation in sacks. Michigan State, number one in the Big Ten in fewest sacks allowed. So who wins that battle, the pass rush of Ohio State or the pass protection of Michigan State?
And normally I don't care about the Heisman, but this year, unbelievable, Heisman field. This is going to be, depending on what happens with Joe Burrow, I think that game, LSU and Alabama, it's going to be like, I hope it's going to be like 68-63, maybe like Washington State and UCLA was, but that's going to be a shootout. Yeah. But what are your thoughts on the Heisman race? Where are you on that right now?
Oh man,
unbelievable!
So many quarterbacks. Yeah, so many quarterbacks that are lighting it up. It's Jalen Hurts, it's Tua, it's Joe Burrow, as you said, and then you got Jonathan Taylor out there. You got Justin Fields from Ohio State. Even though I'm not sure he's the best player on his own team, Chase Young, the defensive end for Ohio State, I think is better and could end up. He could be the top pick unless the team absolutely is sure they want a quarterback. So it's a fascinating Heisman race at this point.
Chase Young's the kind of guy that could be a Hugh Green in the Heisman race. I mean, Ohio State should be promoting him because that would be an amazing story. Maybe they just haven't thought of it yet. Yeah. They're too busy driving around their free cars. I saw the amazing statistic that you guys had on your great podcast where Dan Wetzel cited, and I know he wrote about it in his article, about the explosion of employees and salary in the University of Michigan athletic department. 2011, I think there were like 118 or 188, and then I think there were like 298 or 300 something just 8 years later, and the salaries had gone up. When I worked at Ohio State, I actually worked at the flagship station WENS. I remember, Pat, that the Ohio State athletic department, they had 100 people there who were driving those yearly free rental cars. You get the nice Lincoln or whatever it is.
Right. Sure.
This was at the time when Terrell Pryor was being followed around by TV stations in this beat up Camry, and they were focused on his license plate, like he was some sort of criminal. So ultimately, with what's going to play out here, what's your best guess on what we're going to have maybe a year from now, as far as this law is concerned that's come out of California? What do you think will have a resolution?
I think the NCAA will put something forward, within a year that will try to address things nationally as opposed to just, this state by state piecemeal. They want this, somebody else wants that sort of thing. So I think that's going to be the big question is, can the NCAA put out something that is acceptable to kind of call off the dogs here from the political standpoint? I expect they'll have something. I just don't know whether it's going to be good enough.
Pat, I really appreciate you dropping by. Thanks so much, man, for taking the time.
Sure.
That was great.
Hey, great to see you. Good talking to you, Brooks.
You too. That's Pat Forty of Yahoo Sports. Does a great job. Pat, Pete Thamel, and Dan Wetzel are the three musketeers of college football. And, of course, Dan does everything. And Pat and Pete both do all college sports, the big-time sports. But they give you everything over at Yahoo Sports. They're going to break news. They do long form, and they work their asses off, to bring you things, different angles. It's definitely a compelling place to go. And so we're really happy to have Pat on. And his daughter is a swimmer at University of Alabama, I think. So, and I guess she's on the national team, as he said. But if you follow him on Twitter, he is a proud... Oh, Stanford. Ooh, wow. That's some thin air up there. I walk onto that campus at Stanford, I can't even breathe. The air is too thin. Yeah. By the way, if you've ever been to Stanford, just comparing Stanford to Cal, no comparison in terms of campuses. Stanford is a dump. Dump. Compared to Cal, at least. Cal is a magnificent place. Stanford looks like, I don't know, just flat and decorative buildings and whatever. Not a lot going on. Stadium, just out in the open, nothing there. But University of California, Berkeley, if you're ever in the Bay Area, man, it is spectacular. And the stadium there is built on a fault line, which is well documented. But if you sit on the east side of the stadium, at Cal. If you're in Berkeley, of course, you're across the bay. You can look over the bay and see downtown San Francisco, and it is, for my money, I've been to the Rose Bowl many times. Trying to think of the views of other places. I'm sure up in Montana State, I'm sure there's a lot of BYU and Utah. I'm sure you get beautiful views, and the University of Washington, where you see Lake Washington, and people can pull up in their boats and their yachts. That's how they do their tailgating out there. The moneyed elite at the University of Washington. So that's a beautiful sight. But so we're really happy to talk to Pat Forty, talk some college football, and we're going to be talking. Folsom Field in Colorado. Cam Smith, our producer, offers that one up. Yes, absolutely, especially when you got this going on right there. And I'm not talking about a cigarette. So nothing wrong with that, right? Colorado. So coming up, we're going to talk to Sam Monson of Pro Football Focus. So covered everything in college football. We didn't talk about the A&M Alabama game. Ironic when you consider Pat's in Alabama today, but I really wanted to touch on what I thought were the biggest games. Should have asked him about Michigan, though, shouldn't I have? Michigan is hosting Iowa, and this is one of those games. It's a no-brainer. Michigan's got to win the game. I just get the sense. I get the sense that Jim Harbaugh is checking out. He's not the same person, and I've seen a lot of people mention this. Media people, Twitter, making observations during Michigan games that he's not as engaged as he used to be. But when it comes right down to it, for Michigan this season, you think about everything that goes into that program, not just from Harbaugh. It's unimaginable, the effort and the time, and God knows the money, right? Recruiting, coaching, everything, facilities, logistics, academics. Of course, that's way down the list. All that stuff, right? Their season, to me, is coming down to one thing. Jim Harbaugh calling up Nick Saban and Saban recommending Josh Gaddis and Harbaugh making him Michigan's offensive coordinator. And the rest is history. And they're struggling against Army, and they're getting blown away by Wisconsin. So we'll know more. This is a huge test for Michigan because we have Iowa's actually pretty good. I'm selling them short. So this is a solid team. Maybe not as good as Wisconsin. Who knows, though? Big Ten. These teams play nobody. And, Iowa, perennial good team, not great. Challenger, not champion. So that's going to be one of the games that's on my screen. When you're picking out games that you're going to have on screens. And why shouldn't you have like 50 screens? Televisions are like $3 now. They're giving them away. Practically, right? But that's a game I'm going to be watching. Michigan and Iowa, Ohio State, Michigan State. It's a little bit like for Ohio State. I wouldn't call this a tune-up fight. Maybe if this was a boxing analogy, right? Michigan State is, a contender that's ranked 5th, something like that. But not a top contender per se. Same old Michigan State. Crappy offense, good defense, all kinds of mayhem going on off the field. D'Antonio with his line defense, getting away with it. Doesn't matter. I mean, this has been going on. The stuff that's going on off the field right now, one of the former assistants of D'Antonio is suing him right now, saying that they made him a scapegoat, fired him as a scapegoat because a former Michigan State football player was caught sexually assaulting two Michigan State students. He is now in prison for 10 years. But this guy, the former assistant coach who was fired, lays out how D'Antonio individually, specifically, personally got involved with this top recruit and recruited him with this assistant who's now suing him. And apparently this player in high school had a lot of problems related to inappropriate behavior around women and girls. And D'Antonio refused to acknowledge it, brought the kid on campus, and we saw what happened there. And now D'Antonio distancing himself. But the guy is suing Michigan State and the football program. And, you know, you can say, oh, it's getting ugly, all that stuff. But unless we have a real overt smoking gun with D'Antonio's signature on it, that's the key. Jim Tressel got fired at Ohio State because emails came out with his signature on it, things that he was writing in an email, right? His personal account. That's why he was fired, because I was there and I remember. Unless you have that level of evidence against these guys, it doesn't matter if you have a mountain of circumstantial evidence, if you have a mountain of people testifying, it's irrelevant. You know, the irony of it is the idea that D'Antonio is this great coach. What the hell? What has he ever done? Nothing. Now, we look at everything in the context of the college football playoff. Maybe Michigan State fans don't have that high of expectations. But if you said that to them, they'd freak out and say, no. We want to be in the playoff every year. I mean, the one year they made the playoff, they were embarrassed. Right? And now, same old story. The Arizona State game, can't move the ball, blah, blah, blah. So why would you keep this guy around? This is also the guy who ESPN broke news about after the Larry Nassar thing came to light. ESPN really piled on. In a sense, it's not a pile on if what they're reporting is true and was egregious and should have been reported. And to their credit, that's what happened. But as the Nassar controversy was coming out 2 or 3 years ago, ESPN apparently had done all of this reporting or investigating, I should say, on D'Antonio and Tom Izzo, because Izzo has harbored his own bad actors, right? But they were coaches, assistant coaches, I do believe. So when Nassar came out, ESPN splashed this big story about D'Antonio and Izzo. And of course, it's perceived as a pile-on, but nothing happens. And we get the same treatment of those guys today. They're gods and they're heroes. And it just comes down to our society, right? We don't care. We want to be entertained. We don't want to be bothered. It's really amusing to hear people like Jim Delaney in his pushback on this new law that would actually allow college athletes to be citizens of the United States, have the basic rights of citizens, right? If somebody wants to pay them money for their name, image, and likeness, you're allowed to take the money, right? Today, if somebody wants to use the name, image, and likeness of Trevor Lawrence at Clemson, well, they pay the money to Clemson, right? They don't pay the money to Trevor Lawrence, even though he earned it, even though he's the only person who's the reason that they want to spend the money. The jerseys that are at the Clemson bookstore that are number 16 are being bought because of Trevor Lawrence, right? I don't think it's too much to say. That's a basic civil right in the United States, right? Pretty simple. But when you look at Jim Delaney pushing back on now this principle of actually paying the athletes for their likeness, and Emmert's the same way, and everybody's the same way, really. It's this boilerplate reference to education, our educational mission, that everything is educationally based. Particularly ironic when you consider the NCAA. Now, the NCAA is intimately involved in basketball. Why? Because it controls the money. It negotiates the television contracts. It does not in football. So it only serves, as I said a million times, as a shield providing cover for stealing the players' money. That's why the NCAA exists as far as the schools are concerned. And the schools would never detach themselves from the NCAA in football. Why would they? I've heard people say that over the last few days. Well, all the power conferences and the Power 5 teams, they're going to go create their own. Why? They control all the money. The NCAA is their shield, is their pretense. That's their rules that they don't have to follow because they have their own in-house compliance, right? So, it's unbelievable when you think about the level of incomprehension of this issue. It's incomprehensible when I listen to people talk about it. They have so little understanding of the basic situation of what's happening, right? And how the reason this is a quagmire and a disaster in terms of this state here, that state there, federal, different rules. They've got an agent in this law, an agent provision. This law won't have it or whatever, right? This is a mess. It's a disaster to a certain extent. But it only exists because of the monstrous injustice that we have all signed off on, right? You may not care about it. Most people don't. I'm one of the few. And in my research over the past few years, because I've spent a lot of time researching college football, what really drew me to that research was, if you look back in the history of the United States and you're trying to figure out what was it like in 1940 or 1930 or 20, what was it really like? You're not going to find out from reading newspapers because there were literally no individuals of color working at those newspapers, and there weren't any until basically 1970. And I mean the Des Moines Register, the San Francisco Chronicle, the New York Times. Doesn't matter if it was outside the South, right? The way to find out what was going on in the United States was to do two things: read black newspapers and follow football. Football was kind of the signpost, was kind of the litmus test, the marker, I should say the bar for civil rights in the United States. Why? Because when Michigan benched Willis Ward, its best player, in 1934, because Georgia Tech told them to, and the game was in Michigan, it was reported. And it was reported nationally. And that happened hundreds of times where teams outside the South benched black players. And so if you look at that situation, I mean, Michigan's at home, right? That's their only black player. He's their best player, and they lost the game. And Georgia Tech says, we're not going to play against a black player. So they benched him. That tells you about the climate of the day. That's what I mean. It was like a scorecard. So you can read and read and read and study and study, study, and listen to audio and watch video of people from that period. Watch, popular entertainment, watch politicians. You're not going to find out anything. Nothing. Actually, I will say this. If you, having looked at the newsreels back then, there are some unbelievably blatant racist newsreels that came out from Universal and Hearst, just all the mainstream stuff, where there was some unbelievably racist, voiceover stuff whenever an African-American event was filmed. In fact, an African-American football game, I think it was a high school football game in Chicago. It's an infamous newsreel, but it's a mainstream newsreel where they, had all of this mocking language and stereotypical language about Black people that was affixed to basically kids in high school playing high school football because they were Black high schools in Chicago, and it was awful. So sports is really the unvarnished signpost of the times. Now, let's go back to today and go back to what we talked about early in the show when I was telling you about Nolan West of Minnesota, who is supporting the idea of compensating college athletes for their likeness. Yeah, and he's been accused of racism in his own state publicly, and he uses the term racial injustice as part of his justification for submitting a bill to the Minnesota legislature. And he's not alone. That's happened. It's happened in a couple of other places. And conservative politicians, at least one that I know of in Florida, who is a big Trump supporter, as a matter of fact, far right guy, he has been using the race card in reference to his support of this issue, which tells you that it has a very, very good chance of passing in Florida. The only states where it's probably not going to pass, what we talked about earlier, South Carolina. We already know that the majority leader in the state legislature of South Carolina has said, I don't think it's going to pass. Well, Clemson's there. They want the status quo. Now, that'll change, perhaps. The silver bullet in this whole situation, the NCAA doesn't have a silver bullet outside of its own organization. It has to do something. And now I think the situation that we're facing here, with the NCAA is they are going to move on changing the rules and facilitating the situation themselves. That's the only way out here. Besides a federal law, that's the only way out. So, Cam, who do we have coming up next? Okay. Let's say hello to Sam Monson of Pro Football Focus. And he is a football oracle. If ever there was someone that you wanted to talk to and you want to know something about football, holy mackerel, this guy. He's the guy to talk to. Thanks a lot, Sam. I appreciate it.
Anytime. Sorry for the technical difficulties.
No, well, I appreciate your patience. Thanks so much. And so Pro Football Focus, I could come on here and talk to you about rankings because most people, that's what they're going to talk about. Why are the Niners going to win the division? You got them up there. And we may get into a little bit of that, indulge myself with that, right? But I'm really interested in the player grading system in general. And of course, it's pro and college. But how did it come about? What was the germ that brought it about?
Yeah, really, all the credit goes to Neil Hornsby, the PFF founder. He kind of created this system himself. He was inspired by, the great Dr. Z, Paul Zimmerman. He used to do a lot of his own player grading. I'm really the same inspiration. Both those guys were kind of fed up of listening to announcers say, this guy's one of the best in the league, or he's the best to do it. And you watch these guys play and you think, really? I mean, they're not. They're okay or they're good or whatever, but they're not the best. They're not the worst. So he said, well, look, let's start grading these guys and try and find out who is the best and the worst. And so Neil kind of set up this system, just a bit of an elaboration on the plus-minus system that most coaches use in-house in some capacity in the NFL. And then he started bringing on people to help him do games, just as a hobby to begin with. So Ben Stockwell was really the first guy that came on to help him devise the grading system. And, Neil and Ben basically created this system. So instead of just a plus and a minus system that NFL coaches typically use, one of the big differences at ours is we have 0 grades. So they're the kind of expected grades. Nobody went above and beyond. Everybody did their job. You get a 0. If you did something above expectation, you get the plus. If you do something below expectation, you get the minus. And then we have a couple of steps beyond that, severity of plus and minus grades. But, ultimately you end up collecting all of these numbers and you end up with a grade at the end of it, whether it's over the course of a game, over the course of a season, over the course of a career.
You mentioned, I think, on the About page of Pro Football Focus, you've got 300 employees. Is that right?
I think if you include all the part-time guys that help us do games in season, we're probably closer to 400 or 500 at this point. We've got something like 80 full-time guys and then an army of part-time people that help do the games.
Now, are these people working remotely?
Most of them, yeah. So we have an HQ here in Cincinnati. This little cave that I'm stuck in at the moment is one part of it. There used to be an old like film storage building of some kind. So all these, like, there's these tiny rooms everywhere. They're just brick hovels. So we got probably 30 people or so in this building, and then everyone else works remotely in some capacity in a few different countries.
Now, when you look at the pro rankings, that's what at least I had really been familiar with, and I started digging in around your website recently. What about college? I mean, you do such an extensive amount of grading for every single player and I mean linemen, everybody, for every single play. How do you handle college?
Yeah, college was a huge undertaking. The first season of college we did was back in 2014. And it was really the first big thing that happened to PFF when Chris Collinsworth bought a majority stake. So Chris came in, and the big thing he wanted to do was, what would it take to get college done? Because that would, propel this thing to the next level. And honestly, we didn't really staff up until after that first season. So the first season of college football in 2014 was an absolute grind for everybody doing games. We did an absolute ton of stuff. And then once the NFL season finished, that was like our chance to catch up on college. We weren't able to do it sort of following along live, but we had to finish all of the college games that we hadn't got to yet in that January of 2015. So that was an absolute slog. And then since then, we've added a whole bunch of staff that have sort of stepped up and staffed us up to be able to do college. But yeah, we now do every single FBS game over the course of the season, in addition to all the NFL games. And then, we look at other leagues as well. So last season, we did the ill-fated AAF, the Alliance. We did that all the way through. I think we'll probably take a swing at the XFL when that starts up as well.
So was doing college a function of the draft?
Yeah. So the idea being that, if we have all this data on college players, we can start to see how they project to the next level. We can start to figure out the draft instead of just this crapshoot where people are just taking hunches on players they like, or skill sets, or measurables. It's like, well, let's try and see what translates. So, initially it's, let's trust the grading and let's sort of ignore the physical freak players, and let's start looking at guys that grade really well. And I think as we go, we start to learn that, there's obviously something to athleticism. It's not everything, but there's probably a line that players need to be able to exceed if they're going to succeed, no matter how well they grade in college, because the level is better, right? So you can't just look at the grading. You need to start factoring in some level of athleticism. And then there's areas, what area do you need to grade well in? Not just whether you grade well overall, but is there a certain thing you need to grade really well at for that to translate to the next level? And these are all things that we're starting to learn as we go through and as we do more years of this.
Talking to Sam Monson of Pro Football Focus, how much of what you do, if at all, is based on feedback that you get from outside the organization, maybe as it pertains to the grading process, formulas? I mean, do you tweak them based on in-house observations, outside observations, or do you not tweak them all?
No, we do. We've definitely evolved this as we go. I think one of the good things about PFF is that we're always striving to get better. We didn't know what we were doing when we started this. We had a rough idea, which is, let's start putting things down on paper. Let's start putting down and evaluating guys on a play-by-play basis and see what that comes up with at the end. But ultimately, we don't know how much you should value pass rushing versus run defense, how much you should value blocking as a receiver versus what they do in all that. So a lot of those things, we lean on our data science guys now. We've got a couple of those in-house, George Shahuri and Eric Eager in particular. Those guys are really cranking numbers and math and be able to tell us now how much we should be weighting some of this stuff. So that shapes some of the evolution of the grades. And then feedback we get from NFL, whether it's players, teams, coaches, all of these guys have valuable feedback in terms of what we should be looking for in certain plays, what we should be diagnosing, what we should be grading, all those kind of things. So yeah, it's been a constant process. And I think one of the great things that now we have 32 NFL team customers, we have 60 plus, I think, college FBS team customers. We have this huge access to knowledge and to information, to feedback from all these guys in terms of what we should be looking to focus on and get better at.
What is it that you guys do that people are most interested in? Like every week they want to get their hot little hands on what?
I think the two things that we do that are really valuable to people are offensive line grades, because there's really not a wealth of information on offensive linemen, period. Everyone uses sort of sacks, how many sacks that team gave up that week, but that's a huge product of everything. It's the offensive system, how long the quarterback held the ball, whether the quarterback himself was the problem, whether running backs missed their blitz pickup. So us being able to identify how many sacks, hits, hurries offensive linemen gave up, how well they did in the run game, offensive line stuff has always been really good for us. And then the other area that's kind of along the same vein is coverage numbers. Everybody thinks they know how cornerbacks are playing based on the sort of highlight reel that you remember from a game, but we're able to tell you the statistics, how many catches this guy gave up, what were their coverage numbers when he was going up against the number one wide receiver and that kind of thing. So coverage numbers and offensive line grades and those things, I think, have always been huge for us.
Talking to Sam Monson of Pro Football Focus in Cincinnati. To go get some chili after this, man.
That's not chili. That's not chili.
That's not. It's a little runny, right? It's watery.
It is.
I know what you're saying.
Yeah, it's not. I don't know what it is, but it's not chili.
Yeah, you don't put chili on your freaking noodles, all right?
No.
It's like spaghetti. It's glorified spaghetti. So you don't go to Skyline. You don't go to what is it? Blue Star, Gold Star.
Gold Star. Yeah, I've been to Skyline once since I came here, and it.
Now, how long you been there?
Didn't make me want to go back. Let's put it that way.
Interesting. Have you had White Castle?
I haven't actually. It's one of the few sort of American places I haven't been to.
Wow. So where are you originally from?
Ireland.
Yeah, where in Ireland?
Dublin.
So how did you get over here?
So I moved over in summer of 2017. Basically, when Chris Collinsworth bought the company, he set up. You
have no accent.
So my problem is all the way through my life, I pick up new accents wherever I go, right? So I moved around a lot as a kid. We lived in America for a year. I lived in England a lot, and I've had like probably half a dozen accents in my life. And I had just got like my full Irish accent back, and then moved over here, and now it's disappearing again.
But so yeah, tell us. I interrupted you there. Tell us a little bit about the process, and were you a American football fan before you came over?
Yeah. So when Chris Collinsworth bought the company, he's from the Cincinnati area, or at least has been here since he played for the Bengals. So he wanted to set up PFF HQ over here. So Neil Hornsby was moved over, the first person. A couple of the other core PFF team moved over to Cincinnati as well. And then I eventually moved over in summer 2017. I'd been a football fan for years, really dating back to that year I spent in America as a kid, kind of followed it as a fan. And then really the interesting thing is most of the original core PFF people, Neil Hornsby met online on a message board, the NFL UK, the official message board there. Ben Stockwell, myself, a guy called Khaled El Sayed, Gordon McGuinness, a few of us, so the original PFF guys, we were all on that message board. So when Neil needed guys to help him start doing games, that's where he went to, guys that knew football well enough, knew what they were doing, and he kind of knew them a little bit, and that's sort of where he drew the original group from.
So you have one guy doing a single game. How long does that take?
Well, so we used to, way back at the start, that's how it worked. We had one guy doing one game. Now we've been able to, as we develop the process and we've moved to sort of cloud-based software, it enables multiple people to work on the game at the same time. So it's massively sped up the process and what we're able to do. So now a game is broken down into multiple different processes. So one guy goes through and does the base data, the stuff that's kind of in the, the NFL Jesus game books, whether it's first and 10 on the 45-yard line, left hash mark, all that kind of stuff. Our next guy comes in, he does the player participation. Who's on the field? Where are they? What do they do? Then a guy comes in and does the sort of more analyst level stuff that here's the grading. Here's the stuff that they actually did and the stuff that's a little bit less black and white. And there's a few other processes that take all 22 angles and that kind of thing. But I think in total, we probably have, and every one of these processes gets double blind done and then sort of cross-checked with each other. So trying to eliminate as many of the errors as we can by the end. Ultimately, I think there's probably 8, maybe 12 people work on a given game. And we can get them done sort of pretty quickly, but I think it's something like 20, 25 man hours per game.
Wow.
Total by the time they're up.
So last question for you. And I can't believe I'm not going to ask you about any of the controversial rankings or gradings, but no, maybe next time. But so I wanted to know your customer base outside of the teams. Of course, you provide that. You have those relationships now with all the NFL teams. Do you have relationships with college teams?
We do, yeah. So we have, I think, 60. It's on our Twitter bio,
wow.
The exact number right now, but 60 plus college FBS customers.
So, and I know you do a lot of stuff, a lot of media, but from what you understand, is your customer base besides the teams gamblers, fantasy players, fans, agnostic from that stuff? What do you understand that to be?
I think we have a few different cohorts. So we have the kind of hardcore football fan, and that's probably where we started from. With Premium Stats was our original product, and it was really just this tabular format of grades and player stats. And I think that's where our kind of hardcore NFL fan base, the kind of guys that just love to geek out on numbers and data. But then we have a very strong fantasy football following, and that's really where a huge amount of our peak sales come from in season. And then we do have gamblers. We created a product last year called PFF Greenline, and it's our attempt to kind of leverage all the PFF data against, the spread, against Vegas odds and Vegas lines, and try and basically give you an advantage betting based off what the data tells us. Right, very early on, we were able to determine that, PFF grades, basically how good a team was able to get you 70-75% of the way to the Vegas spread. So we can get very close to be able to predict what should happen in a game and where the line should be. So, yeah, we've got an ever-increasing gambling following as well that they use PFF.
Amazing stuff. Thanks so much for taking the time and your patience with the whole process of getting on. I really appreciate it, Sam.
No, thanks for having me. I'm just glad we could do it.
That's Sam Monson. He's with PFF, Pro Football Focus in Cincinnati, and one of the premier places that I go to. You should go to for your information about football. I was just going through it today. I've always leaned on pro football there, but college football, it's a great resource. And once in a while, you'll see Sam on one of the networks like ESPN or Fox Sports, and invariably it's over a ranking, which is a great compliment to them. It's usually over a ranking. I think the big controversy was this week. I heard somebody reference that Carson Wentz. I may have mentioned it on the show. I think I used it in a question to Kaplan yesterday. Yeah, I did. That Carson Wentz had been ranked the number one quarterback in on PFF because they do rankings, probability that a team's going to win the division. And I was going to ask him if I didn't want to keep him all day, but we want him to come back. I was going to ask him about the Niners being their top NFC West team in terms of percent chance to win the division. That came out on the site this morning. Got the Seahawks and the Rams, and there's the Niners. But the Niners play great defense, run the ball well, and Jimmy G's still getting his sea legs, I guess, and we'll see what happens with them. Coming up, we're going to talk to Darren Heitner, an attorney. Let's bring him up now and get the very latest on what's going on in Florida He's on the cutting edge. He's part of the vanguard of the latest bill that's going to be dropping in the Florida legislature. Thanks so much for joining us, Darren. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So what's the status update of the bill in Florida?
The update is, as of half an hour ago, it was actually published. So now you have an official title, a House bill that is going to go through committees. It will be in the general session, and ultimately we're going to look for a Senate sponsor as well in the state of Florida. And at the end of the process, put it on the governor's desk and hopefully get it signed. Our goal is to have an effective date of July 1, 2020, which is stated at the very end of the bill. There are the California bill, which made a lot of headlines over the past couple of weeks. We did take that California bill, used it as a model, fine-tuned it in our estimation, tried to take as many ambiguities out of it as possible. And I think some important highlights of how ours differs from that of the California bill includes that only currently enrolled student athletes will have this opportunity to exploit their name, image, and likenesses for commercial opportunities for that type of benefit. And that was a really big sticking point. A lot of people were concerned that giving athletes this ability would now lead to a Pandora's box, where opening of the Pandora's box, where colleges will now be able to recruit athletes to this effect. Well, the individuals will not have these rights until they're actually enrolled in the institutions. We've put in the opportunity for athlete agents to represent the players, but they must be licensed in the state of Florida, and attorneys as well, licensed and in good standing. Another important caveat is we're allowing all public and private universities, and in fact saying that they must allow their student athletes to be able to exploit their name, image, and likeness. In California, that's not yet the case. They have an exploratory board that they're putting in place, and also right now, they're not talking about allowing junior colleges and community colleges this opportunity. So there are differences, but there are also a lot of similarities.
I don't know if you've seen the comments from Mark Emmert in Indianapolis that came out in the Indianapolis Star as part of an interview with that newspaper, Darren. Earlier today, it was published, and this is a remark from Mark Emmert. When he's referencing their working group, he says, that's what this group is working on. It would take some months, but they would finalize any of their rule changes. And he's referencing, of course, SB 206 and what you guys are doing, I'm assuming. But doesn't that sound like the NCAA is about to raise the white flag and try to create a silver bullet, maybe that will preempt what's going on with you guys?
Hope so. We would love nothing more than for the NCAA to change its position, raise the white flag, and allow across the board student athletes to earn money off of their name, image, and likeness. That would be the best solution possible. Otherwise, we'd also like to see federal action. If enough states step up, Florida leading the pack, California in 2023, there's New York, South Carolina, even Minnesota recently indicating that they're going to look at their own pieces of legislation. We would hope that would maybe create momentum on the federal level so that you can have uniformity throughout the states. I mean, obviously our intention is not to create disruption. Our intention is to give these athletes the rights that they deserve. And when it comes to the NCAA, they create committees all the time and very little is actually done. So what Chip Lamarck and I talked about was not waiting. Maybe our efforts actually move the pile and we can get the NCAA to finally raise the white flag, as you mentioned.
One thing I think you've got to take under consideration, and I'm sure this has crossed your mind, if the NCAA is going to hold out their own rule, what are the odds that some of those provisions that you talked about are going to be in the Florida bill are not part of their possible new rule? And one example of what I'm referring to is, what might they take out? Well, you've got some states that have criminalized agents, right, in the context of college athletes. So if you've got laws in place in those states, how are you going to have an NCAA rule that allows agents, to be on campus or with a college athlete in the states that have criminalized that activity?
So that's a great question. And what we're asking, or what what I would suggest is that the NCAA doesn't create a rule allowing for the student athletes to exploit their name, image, and likenesses, but instead repeal the prohibition, which is what's in their rule books. And then it actually should be left up to each and every state as to whether or not they want to keep their athlete agent laws on the books or amend them in some way. And I would suggest that a state that currently criminalizes athlete agents working with college students be changed. And again, we're not suggesting that the athlete agent serves in any capacity other than allowing that person to represent the student athlete on this particular type of contract. We're not suggesting that student athletes and agents should be able to enter into some other form of agency contract where the agent is representing the player for, let's say, professional pursuits later on. So I think we need to be very clear on that point. And look, our bill in Florida is only 6 pages long. It's short on purpose. We're not trying to create loopholes that only serve to cause confusion.
We're visiting with attorney Darren Heitner, and he has helped out on the authorship of this bill in the state of Florida for the Florida legislature that would allow college athletes to financially benefit from their name, image, and likeness. So there's actually another bill that I don't know if it's in the House that you're in the Florida legislature, but talk a little bit about that other bill that's there, and does that affect what you guys are doing?
It absolutely does not affect what we're doing. So Chip Lamarck and I have been working for some time on crafting this particular piece of legislation. And as I told you, we took the California bill, used it as a model, and made a lot of changes to it. I think what happened in the very recent past, when there was so much publicity surrounding California passing its own legislation and the governor in California signing it alongside LeBron James, you had many politicians try to rush as quick as possible to sort of palm off on some of that publicity. And so you have another individual, another politician in the state of Florida who actually copied and pasted the California bill in its entirety and submitted it, I believe, earlier this week.
Well, and it's doing media as we speak.
Yeah, there you go. So we have run our bill up the chain of command. We've spoken with very powerful individuals in the House, in the Senate of Florida. We've talked to the governor and everyone who surrounds the governor. We believe that our bill is something that has been fine-tuned for the state of Florida. We think it's actually a better bill than what's been passed in California. And we do believe that we have the support that's necessary in our state. So we're not really concerned with the other bill. Perhaps the sponsor of that legislation drops it. Who knows? We're merely focused at this point in pushing our bill along.
So it sounds like you've done your due diligence, but the bottom line is this thing going to pass when they vote on it? What's the deal? Is it going to pass?
We believe so. Again, we're going to run it through the proper committees right now. And then when Congress is back in session, it'll be on the floor. We believe that we'll have the support to get it passed, and we believe that we'll have the support of the governor's office as well.
Darren, I can't thank you enough. I know you've been busy today. The bill, I guess, just went live. Outstanding to have you, and great work on this thing.
Thank you very much.
That's Darren Heitner. He is a sports attorney, and you can catch him on Twitter. Very prominent attorney. Darren Heitner, one word, DarrenHeitner. And wow, we sat there and talked about it, and then we had the guy on who helped to write it. And it's live now in Florida. And I really believe that the remarks by Mark Emmert that we brought to you earlier from Indianapolis, it was actually yesterday, probably are in response to what Chip Lamarca, the state representative who is the sponsor of the bill, that's who he was referencing, and Darren Heitner are doing. It has to be. Why would the NCAA move so quickly to evolve the rules, right? If it was 2023, why would they be in such a hurry? And you talk about great publicity for Gavin Newsom, the governor who wants to run for president. Look, this is a great thing that they're doing, and I'm happy they're doing it, but he went a little over the top. Maybe not, actually, though. You think about it. This is such a landmark thing, a groundbreaking thing, that he just comes off as smarmy or whatever, a little over the top. But And the LeBron James thing, I don't know. I don't know what to say about that. I mean, I think about how important that law could end up being, because I think eventually it'll lead, as Emmert has said. In fact, I have no doubt. And I mentioned this to our producer, Cam Smith. What's happening right now, if you want a comparison in time, if you know what this is perestroika to the NCAA. And Mark Emmert is Gorbachev, right? Without the male pattern baldness and the birthmark. Perestroika is happening right now to the NCAA. If you remember that, it was Gorbachev trying to hold off for as long as he could changes to the government. Basically, it was one big gang of people doing whatever they wanted. And once there was a little pinprick in the dam, he couldn't stop it. So he tried to make limited changes at the beginning. He tried to control it at the beginning. A great book to read on that subject, phenomenal book, is called Lenin's Tomb by David Emmerich. It is an incredible read. It really is one of my favorite books, long book. But it reminds me of what Emmerich's dealing with right now, because everything's a hedge. Everything is parsing, just like what we read to you. You had that ridiculous sentence. Well, we're going to have to change the rule that everybody's already happy with. Isn't that funny? But so looks like we're at least getting started here. And but I'm very, 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 very suspicious about the NCAA proffering a rule that would supersede what everybody else. We're all just going to fall in line and agree with something that they're going to do. Please. After the rhetoric that's come out from guys like Gene Smith at Ohio State saying that, I'm not going to schedule California schools. Where does that come from? I mean, it comes from Mark Emmert. That mentality. The mentality is a stone wall. It's pathological. It's unmoving, unwavering. It has to be. It has to be. Because it's such a monstrous injustice what they're doing. So they can't do anything that might indicate a weakness or a crack in the dam. And now we're talking to the guy who's involved in cracking that dam. So a great show today. I appreciate my producer, Cam Smith, who worked his ass off today and working through everything. You have no idea what it takes to get this show up and running. And he does a great job. So earlier today, we had Pat Forty from Yahoo Sports. Also, we were joined by Sam Monson of Pro Football Focus. What a cool story that is. Came over from Dublin, Ireland. And I didn't hear his accent at the beginning. Took a while. And then we just had Darren Heitner on from Florida, who is helping to author that new bill that's actually now been published. And so we're going to update the website. You can go to SportsbyBrooks.com. I update all the states, and we'll include some of this video as well on the website from Darren, since we're making news. Sort of, I think, kind of, yeah. Nobody else has done anything with Darren yet. He's one of the authors. But we'll be back coming up next week, Monday through Friday. We do it right here on Fancred. And from Los Angeles, this is Brooks Melchior saying so long for Sports by Brooks on Fancred.